I think we can go ahead with today's webinar. And good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Mark Leggett, and I'm the Executive Director for Research Data Canada. And this is one of our guest webinar series in the RDC webinars, which you can access via the RDC website, which is rdc-drc.ca. I'll introduce today's topic and our speaker shortly, but just a couple of administrative notes. The webinar has two ways to ask questions, and we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature. That helps us a lot in queuing up the questions and indicating when they've been responded to. You can also use the chat, but again, our preference is if you use the Q&A feature to facilitate our queuing of those. The questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, just to give our speaker an opportunity to go through her slide deck and present the information. And I will facilitate sending those questions to our guest speaker as I receive them. The webinars are recorded. They will be made available via the archive link on that RDC webinar page. They're generally available just after the webinar is completed. And for those of you who would prefer a French version of the webinar, as today's webinar is entirely in English, this same speaker and the same content will be delivered tomorrow. That's Thursday also at 1300 Eastern Time. So please feel free to log in for that one as well, or let your colleagues know that we feel would benefit from hearing the French version. So with that, I will introduce our guest speaker, Ariadne Legendre, who is at SSHRC. She is a senior analyst with the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And Ariadne is part of that team that is working on a number of aspects of the data management file, as I call it. And she'll describe recent efforts to create a common research classification. And as I can tell from the number of logs we have in the webinar today, people clearly understand that this effort will help facilitate a more cohesive and interoperable research ecosystem in Canada. So with that, Ariadne, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Research Data Canada, for having me. I'm extremely happy to be here to talk to you about this project because, one, I think it's a great project that's needed, and two, I think it's a great example of how the federal funding agencies are working together and with Statistics Canada. So, like Mark, as you mentioned, my name is Ariadne, and I am a senior data analyst for SSHRC. And I'm the project manager for the development of a common research classification. So today I'm here really with my multi-agency hat to talk to you about this great project. So let me just figure it out. Oh, I can't move my slide. Okay. So what are we talking about when we're classifying research? So as most of you probably know, when a researcher applies for funding at one of the federal agency, we ask them to, one, identify the field of research that best describes their expertise, and two, identify the field of research that best describes the project they're asking for funding. With that data, what we do, it does support the peer review adjudication process to make sure that we match the proper application with the proper reviewers. And we use that data to report on our efforts and investment at the agency level, and then we'll combine it with other agency or other organization to have a better national pictures, and then we'll also compare it at the international level. However, right now, each organization uses different classification, and in some cases, one funding agency may use more than one classification, and we use the same terminology for different dimensions of research, or different dimension uses the same terminology. And then if you had the provincial organization, universities, and the CCV, and all the organization in there, that becomes very hard to have good data. Not only that, but some of these classification have not been reviewed in over 20 years, and only captured what that organization's mandate is. So for SSHRC, it only captures the social science and humanities disciplines, and not the other ones. So it makes it really hard to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges. And recognizing this a few years back, that there may be an opportunity for the agency to align the classification, and that they've started looking at the feasibility of doing this, some of the best practices, the challenges and opportunities that would come. And they decided, finally all the drivers came together this year, and they decided to go ahead and work on developing one common classification. And really, I think the main drivers were that, we can't identify evolving research very nicely, and it's needed. And we also need research is more and more not just multidisciplinary, but multi-sectorial. So it's the fields of natural science with social science that meet together and do great research sometimes, right? And we need to be able to better identify that. There's also more and more collaboration between different bodies that I think can be better supported. And to better support all of these, we need better data on the research that we fund. So, and I think we are all on the agreement that we're in a day now that we can't just make changes, we need data to support this. So with better data also would come better support to the research community. So, acknowledging also that one common classification is not going to solve the world, but I think it will improve better identifying researchers and research. It will better identify multidisciplinary research. And, especially for the researchers that are applying to different councils, it will reduce the burden and the confusions. At the end, we'll get better data out of this to better support the community. And I can say, so, I said for a few years, the councils have been working together on this. And until recently, we were able to get StatScan to come in and work with us. And we've been just so excited about that collaboration, because I think StatScan bring really the expertise that none of the councils have in a research classification, and some of the common best practices that needs to be put in that classification. So we're working with the standards division, and they have been part of they're some of the best experts in the world in classification, and they've been part of developing the OECD Frascati manual. So we're working with that team, and we're also working with the investment, innovation and science division. So we feel like, and they are very happy about that collaboration. It's really a win-win collaboration, because we get their expertise to eventually get better data, and they will get better data to be able to share widely. So I said that, for a few years we've been doing a lot of work looking at, what are the best standards, and what came out loud and clear from that work was that, we should be aligning with international standards, and we shouldn't start from zero. So it was decided that we were going to align with the OECD Frascati manual, which gives guidance on how to report on research and development. And it will be modeled after the Australian New Zealand Standard Research Classification, which has been established for over 10 years and was originally modeled after the Frascati manual. And that classification will give us we'll be able to classify research in 3 dimensions. The first one being the type of activity, which is really really straightforward. It's basic, apply, or developmental. The second dimension will be field of research, which is more kind of like your disciplines of research, and that's where you would find chemistry, immunology, mathematics, and that one is a hierarchy classification, and it goes from about 30 discipline or field of research to about 1,200, so very granular. And again, would cover all the sectors. And the last one is the socioeconomic objectives, and it really talks more about the impact that the research is going to have on the community. And that's where you would find, your subject of research is defense or environment or health in general. And again, this one, it starts at the 5 to about 900, so very granular, and would cover, again, all the main sectors. So the only thing, though, is that classification, the answer classification from New Zealand and Australia, has not been reviewed in over 10 years. And in some cases, we know a lot of emerging research research has evolved a lot in certain fields. So we want to make sure that we review it and that we make it that it reflects Canadian landscape, because the more granular you go, it's really specific to Australia and New Zealand. So for example, they refer to their Indigenous population, which in Australia and New Zealand, it's the Maori and Torres, I think. Obviously, that's not applicable to Canada, so we would adjust that terminology to reflect Canadian landscape at the more granular level. And also, since the ANSERC model was published, there was revision to the Frascati manual. So we'll make sure we align with the latest Frascati manual to better compare ourselves to the world. And to do that, we'll be able, we have a series of revision plan and a series of consultation also. So if that's something that interests you, make sure you're on the lookout for consultation that will come later this year. And that's about all that I have. I do have, I did forget to mention one thing, is that one of the things that is not currently what we have is we don't really have good governance around our current classifications. And that's one thing that we hope to put is a better governance around it, so that it's reviewed on a systematic process. And eventually, once that we have a common terminology, we'll be able to maybe even explore semantic modeling and that kind of stuff. And the other thing is that, it is expected that this classification will be implemented in our systems. However, having said that, for anybody that knows the system and the granting agencies, there's a lot of different systems right now. So we're looking at how this will work. So I don't want to say anything about when that will be implemented, but it is expected that they will be implemented in those systems. So that's all I have for now. So if you guys have any questions, you can ask them now, and you can always shoot me an email afterwards. I'm always happy to talk about this classification project. So.
And thanks, Ariadne. And maybe just before we get to questions, and I note that there's one there now, so give people a few minutes to type in questions if you have any. And just a little more in terms of why Research Data Canada was keen to have this webinar when we heard about the collaboration between CFI, the Tri-Councils, and Statistics Canada. And I think it's safe to say that the research classification and in what is particularly exciting are those 3 kinds of levels of reflection in the classification system that will emerge. Because certainly RDC has a number of interests that would intersect very nicely with that greater detail and more up-to-date detail, whether it facilitates the good metadata in our different kinds of data repositories and institutional repositories, facilitates discovery, the ability, whether it's to get kind of alerts of new research or find collaborators who are working in similar areas, or in those multidisciplinary projects that Ariadne referred to, being able to get a sense of where, you know, the intersections with environment and policy and those kinds of things are with the actual subjects. So I think this is a very exciting opportunity, and happy to have this webinar, and looking forward to the emerging RCS. So I'll just work with the questions as they're received here. So the first question, is there a plan to publish the classification system using a linked open data model to support reuse in other systems, such as internal institutional systems, in alignment with other vocabularies? And you kind of alluded to that, Ariadne. Did you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the plan, to have one classification. And from some of the discussion we've had last week, you know, I think there's a big interest from a lot of different audience to make sure that it's not only available, but it's in the right format. So we, you know, I think stats can already publish all their classifications, so it would be what they're doing, and we'll make sure that that is in that format that's good for good use, right?
Yeah, and I think I see another comment about from colleagues at one of the institutions that are currently using the Australia-New Zealand classification system. So having this will really help them with their internal efforts, and the kind of software systems they're implementing there. And I suspect as the technology evolves, whether people are looking for an RDF variation or other kinds of views or ways of receiving this, I think those kinds of partnerships would be good to highlight in the early stages as our agencies and stats can move forward. So I would encourage anybody who has an interest in particular aspects of this to let them know. Next question is, it looks like you are building a taxonomy. Have you given consideration to allowing the community to create a folksonomy or community-driven taxonomy?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm very familiar with the term folksonomy, but I'll look into that for sure. The idea is that, you know, we want this classification to you know, to represent the research in Canada, but also meet some reporting needs and some needs that we have internally for adjudication processes. So I'll just have, you know, I'm just not familiar with that term, but I'll look into it for sure. Thank you for that suggestion.
And maybe just on another kind of comment rather than a question, Ariadne.
Yeah.
One of the colleagues in the chat noted that in using the New Zealand Australia system, they only had to modify about 20 to 30 headings to reflect Canadian terminology. So that seemed fairly straightforward. But they also did note that the lack of updating of the standard, so the new fields and some of the names for legacy fields in research did not appear very quickly, and also lacking some granularity in some areas.
Yeah.
So just a few comments on colleagues in the Canadian context who have used the answer system.
And that's exactly what we've noticed. So that's why we're not, you know, without spending years reviewing this classification, we're just making sure that we're updating it to reflect today's landscape. So you can imagine that in computer science, especially, a lot has happened in the last 10 years. We just want to make sure that the emerging stuff that is more current is reflected in the classification. So we're just going to do our due diligence to make sure that those are in there. And then we'll put it out, because I think it's, you know, there's an opportunity to put it out and then make it kind of evolve by itself. And after 2 years, after 1 or 2 years, we could review it. And then it would, you know, the little tweak like this that are not relevant anymore, that the emerging field would come out really nicely.
Ariadne commented on the folksonomy piece and that she'll look into that in more detail. And I would probably just add to that that the ability for the community to suggest or contribute terms, as we all know, especially those that work in the library community, can be a challenge. But there's also a way, I think, to layer those kinds of folksonomies in and map them to a consistent and controlled vocabulary like the one that will emerge. So hopefully we'll see some opportunity there. Next question, in terms of the proposed 3 dimensions and the last one on socioeconomic objectives, so coming back to the three levels, how might one classify basic research that may not have an obvious socioeconomic objective?
I think, you know, what the benefit of that, the classification we're building, right, not that we're building, but that we're adapting right now. And if anybody knows about the Australian and New Zealand model, it does come with a user manual that's fairly comprehensive and adds a lot of guidance because it has definition and, you know, guidance throughout and mapping to old stuff. So, you know, we're making sure that that's in there and that it would be very self-evident how you do that. And I think, you know, most people probably have at the beginning have somewhat of an idea of, you know, are they doing this research to benefit health in general, right? Or defense, I think, but, and then there's always the other categories or does not apply. So, I do think that it's broad enough that most people will find a place that they will be able to classify as socioeconomics.
And it sounds like one option with that third level may well be to indicate that at this point in time, at least, there is no intersection at that level.
Right.
Thanks, Ariadne. Now, you did allude to this. Is there a timeline for the project, and will there be a public review period?
Yeah, so the timeline on the project, it was originally dependent on another project, and that project is being delayed. So the timeline, we have a little bit more leeway. But we do want to, like I said, I don't want, you know, we've started, there's a lot of momentum on this, and I think it's needed. So we don't want to let it linger forever. So I think it's safe to say that, you know, sometime next year we would have a new classification. Whether or not it's implemented in all our system, that's another story. And then but you know, like StatsCan is ready to implement this classification. So I think it would just, we're still discussing on how this is going to get implemented everywhere. And we are planning for a public consultation. So the consultation, we did one with Australia and New Zealand, just to, you know, since they've used that classification for 10 years, we wanted to see how it works for them. And we also did an internal one, and we're getting ready to do a subject matter expert one, just to, you know, make sure we validate certain things and we, like I said, clearly identify those emerging fields. And then we'll make sure that, you know, in the fall, we're going to open it to the whole Canadian population. So definitely there will be an opportunity for anybody to comment on this classification.
That sounds good. And I might suggest too, if people have projects that are emerging where you have a kind of a known timeline, or you have feedback that you would like to send directly to Ariadne, or I'd be happy via RDC to facilitate some of the feedback that might suggest timelines that would help with local or regional or even national projects. So if you have any thoughts on that, then certainly let one of us or both of us know. Next question, could we get some idea of how this would be operationalized? For example, at what points will research activity be tagged? Point of application, CVs, awards, etc.
Yeah, so it would be at the CV. That's where we ask about the expertise of somebody, and then on the application, because that's where we would ask about that specific project with the field of research. Those would be the two places.
And then Ariadne, I'm assuming that chosen classification or set of classifications with that CV and application would follow through into the notice of award, or depending on the way what information is put out in terms of awards. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it would be public information. I think right now we publish like the disciplines, and I'm not sure that I can't talk for all the councils on that one, but for SSHRC anyway, I think we published a discipline that the researchers has identified that project to be in. So that would definitely we would still continue to do that. And I think that's where the open data aspect of this type of stuff is, that now we would be able to publish all this data, and if people want to do their own analysis and research on where things are being funded or not funded, and the relationship between certain things, that I think that's where we're going.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, hopefully the new RSC will be published under a license that supports broad reuse. Do you have a sense of that?
I'm sorry about that one. I don't know much about licenses, but the idea is that it will be on open data. Everyone will have access, or on open access. It will be a publicly usable thing. So I'll look into.
Yeah, I think that. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I'll look into whether or not that means we have to have a license or not. I'm just not very familiar with that side of that project, but the idea is that everyone will be able to use it.
Yeah, and I think the questioner is kind of referring to whether or not it has something like a Creative Commons open or public domain license, or those kinds of things that make it clear when the classification is released that it is people are free to reuse it in their projects with or without permission. I think that's what that refers to. But
yeah, I think right now that's what it would be. I mean, that's how every classification
right.
from StatsCan are being used also. So.
Right. The next question, and this refers to some of the comments that I highlighted earlier without identifying the institution, but they're in the Q&A here as such. So now, based on our experience at McMaster, I would ask how much thought might go into describing fields outside STEM, which is where the ANS source seems the weakest. The Australian, New Zealand classification system seem to be the weakest in those science and STEM fields. What are your thoughts on that area?
So again, so what we're doing is we're taking basically the first classification from Frascati, and we're mapping ANSERC to it, because ANSERC, although it's clearly based on Frascati, they had some slight modification. And then, like I said, we're doing a few level of revision to make sure that those meet the need of all the agency, of the research community, and represent modern and Canadian research. So I think we will be addressing those in there.
Yeah, and I think the fact that CIHR, SSHRC, ANSERC, and CFI are all working together with StatsCan on this would highlight I think the ultimate goal of having a pretty granular and reflective representation of all those research areas.
Yeah.
We had another question about timeline, Ariadne, and I know you've responded to the timeline. Did you have anything else to add on terms of the timeline for the project?
No, well, the only thing is that from the beginning, what I've said is that each consultation somewhat dictates the timeline in the next consultation, because if we realize that, we need a lot more time to review some stuff, or to make sure we review wider or whatever it is, that will just take longer, right? We want to make sure we do it without spending years on this, without overdoing it. We want to make sure we have a good classification to put out. But like I said, I think sometime next year we will have a classification.
The final question I have in the Q&A, and just a last reminder that if anybody does have any additional questions, to go ahead and add them into the Q&A. And I've left a link that somebody had added to discussion of folksonomy versus taxonomy. So I'll leave that until we're finish the webinar. So the last question is, how will the classification be managed over time? Will Statistics Canada continue to be involved, and would it be the authoritative source via their website for the new classification system?
Yeah, I think at this point right now, what it's looking like, Statistics Canada will be the custodian of the classification. And like I said, we will put some tighter governance around this classification that would also include the feed or the inputs of the agencies and the research community. But I think somewhat of a common practice in classification is minor revision every 5 years and major revision every 10 years. However, having said that, we're StatsCan and everyone, we're looking at ways to make this a little more dynamic. Like I said, eventually we may be able to explore semantic modeling, or sometimes because of different priorities, you need to update your classification a little quicker. And those are open doors right now. So nothing has really been set in stone yet on that part, but I strongly believe that it's going to be one that will be much better governed over time, with the implication, with StatsCan being implicated and with all the research council together. I think it will be one that will meet the needs of the community and the councils much better.
And maybe just a final comment on that, Ariadne, not exactly the folksonomy approach, but it might be an interesting opportunity with a new effort at a research classification system to consider ways that the broader research community in Canada can contribute to or make suggestions to the ongoing evolution and updating of that research classification system. So that, and the community contribution might be an interesting opportunity for the agencies involved to consider.
Yeah.
Now I don't see any additional questions. I will note that there is a comment in the chat section that highlights again the fact that I think we will see some innovation from not just the public sector in terms of universities and colleges and funding agencies that will use this, but also in our commercial and NGO communities in terms of making use of a common classification. And that also reflects Research Data Canada's interest in terms of representing its broader stakeholder community. So I would note that. Might also use this opportunity to note that SSHRC and the partner councils in CIHR and NSERC released their draft data management policy yesterday for comments up until the end of August. So since I have a number of people on the call, I thought I would mention that. And of course, Ariadne is part of the team that would have been involved with that. So kudos to the Tri-Councils for getting that new draft data management policy out. I'm sure that'll be of interest to everybody on the call. Ariadne, offer you, and if you had anything else you wanted to say before we close?
No, other than, again, thank you for having me. I do think this is a great project that is needed in Canada to better identify the activities that we do in research. And, I would welcome any feedback or suggestion that you may have, send them my way, and be on the lookout for the consultation later this fall.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ariadne. And I would again remind those that are still on the call that Ariadne will repeat today's webinar in French tomorrow at the same time, 1300 Eastern. And as she indicated, if you do have any additional questions or comments regarding the Common Research Classification Project as it moves forward, let her know. And for those of you that are involved with the RDC community, I'm sure we'll be discussing it at a committee level like the Standards and Interoperability Committee. And I'm also sure that our colleagues at organizations like CASRI Canada will be paying attention and commenting. And just before I go, in the Q&A, there is a link to, the person who just typed in the link, the NSERC link. I'm not, that's not the link that I'm familiar with, but I will, I'll chat with Christina, who's from the Canary team, and she's on this call, and see if there's a way that she can add an email when the message is sent out to all those who registered for the webinar today. I'll ask her to include the link to the Tri-Council draft data management policy, because the link that I see in the Q&A is not the one that I'm familiar with. But I will make sure that we get that out to people that are on the call. All right. Thanks everybody again for joining. If you have any suggestions for future RDC webinars, please let me know. The next one that we have queued up after this week with Ariadne is a webinar on the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation out of Europe, and its impacts or intersections with the research community. So that's coming up and featuring a guest speaker, James McGregor from the PKP project out of Simon Fraser. So thanks again for joining, and you will get an email with a link to the recorded webinar as soon as it's available. Thank you all.